Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all as part of Spring Zman at Drisha. This is Mishnah in Depth Nedarim, and it is our fifth and final session. This class is a project of Drisha's Rivka Rosenzwein Zichronah Levrcha Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This course is designed to accompany independent daily study of the Mishnah Yomit following Mishnah Yomit's schedule. We have the pleasure of learning today one last time with Rabbi David Silber. But fear not, learning never ends. This class will continue with the next chapter the following week, same time, with Rabbi A.B. Wolfish. As we have a lot on the plan for today, I'm going to hand things over directly to Rabbi David Silber, but please note, if you're watching on Zoom or Facebook, we want to hear your opinion. You're welcome to ask questions in chat on either platform. I will bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention. And if you're on Zoom, I can make you a panelist so that you can unmute yourself and ask directly. And with that, Rabbi Silber, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. All right. So again, this will be the last session we're doing on Nedarim. I think the Mishnah Yomit actually ends sometime this week, but next week already Rabbi Wolfish will be teaching and great expert in Mishnah. So we're going to try to cover as much as we can this week and to touch on some of the basics of Masechet Nedarim. Now, the last three chapters of Nedarim, as I mentioned before, deal with the issue of the question of how one can annul vows that have been taken. When I say vows, Nedarim, the truth of the matter is that the same principle applies to, for example, oaths, shvua. In this, from the Mishnah standpoint, fundamentally, there's no real difference between taking an oath, a shvua, and making a neder. As I had mentioned in some of the other sessions, later authorities make all kinds of distinctions, but in terms of the two principles of two concepts we're going to deal with now, there is in theory no principle, but this is found in Masechet Nedarim. So it's like this. Chapter 9 of Masechet Nedarim deals with what is known as Hatarat Nedarim. The last two chapters, chapters 10 and 11, deal with something that is known as Hafarat Nedarim. Now we'll discuss today the difference between Hatarat Nedarim and Hafarat Nedarim. Just for starters, the Chumash, there's one chapter in the Torah that deals with Hafarat Nedarim. There is no chapter in the Torah that deals with Hatarat Nedarim. In fact, there's no chapter in the Bible that deals with Hatarat Nedarim. And the Mishnah tells us elsewhere in Masechet Chagiga that Heter Nedarim Porchin Ba'avir, that the principle of Hatarat Nedarim, the annulment of vows, that floats in the air. It has no basis. It's a rabbinic understanding, but it seems to have no basis in the Bible at all. Quite the opposite. It seems to contradict the Bible. The Bible does not seem to know of something called Hatarat Nedarim. That's Hatarat Nedarim. But Hafarat Nedarim is an entire chapter in the Torah that deals with Hafarat Nedarim. And that is chapter 30 of the book of Bamidbar. In that chapter that talks about neder, it talks about a shvua, and specifically it talks about the following case. A woman or a girl, let's say, who takes a neder. She takes a neder, and what the Torah speaks about in chapter 30 of Bamidbar is the ability of her husband, or let's start with this, the ability of her father or her husband to annul her vows. In this respect, the Torah says she's in the domain of the husband or the father. So in other words, till she's married, and we'll get to that, she would be in the domain of the father. And afterwards, she would be in the domain of the husband. Now, there are all kinds of limits placed upon this. And I wanted to point out that the permissibility of the father or the husband to annul the vows, the Torah sets a limit on that. And what the Torah says in chapter 30 of Bamidbar. If you want to pull up chapter 30 of Bamidbar, would not be a bad idea.
Sure, one moment.
If you can pull it up quickly. Bamidbar chapter 30.
Which psukim specifically?
Start from the beginning.
Okay.
Maybe psukim 2 and 3, something like that. This is a key. And this is actually why this tractate is in Seder Nashim, as the Rambam says. This is where the Torah speaks about women, girls or women, and we'll see that very soon. Right. So verse number 3 is about a man that takes a neder. Each neder Hashem, or takes an oath. Lo yachel dvaro. He is not permitted to nullify his vow, to desecrate his vow. Lo yachel, but rather kolchol hayotzei mipiv yaseh. He must fulfill the vow or the oath. That's verse number 3. Now, if we scroll down, keep going down. Yes, next verse. Be isha. That's as far as a man is concerned. But what about a woman that takes a vow? Or she forbids something to herself. When she is in her father's house, binureha. Now the question, binureha is a very important word. We'll come to it very soon. Leave it for now. She's a young woman in her father's house. We'll get to the Gemara's limitation. So if she takes a vow, then continue the next verse. Next verse is, yes. V'shama v'et nidra, and the father hears the vow or the essa or that which she forbids on herself, and the father is silent. If the father says nothing when he hears about the vow, then the vow stands. If he's silent, okay, that's verse number 5. Just 1 second, please.
And just for those following along, if you have your own preferred chumash or a set of mishnayot at hand, you're welcome to use that. But I will also be showing screen sources on Sefaria when Rabbi Silber references them, as he references. Just as Rabbi Silber is going off to teach, I want to highlight, I'm glad that everyone's been learning mishnayot, and if you want to keep learning mishnayot with us, I am going to post the link in chat to where you can sign up for more. All right, welcome back.
I'm sorry about that again. Okay, I'm back. So let's take these first. So if a woman takes the vow and the father hears about it, a young woman, Nara, let's go back to the verses. If the father is silent, then the vow stands. That's verse number 5. What's the next verse? Yeah, keep going. Right. Next verse. But if the father restrains her, they say, when he hears it, then all of her vows, that which forbids herself, lo yakum, will not stand. God will forgive her, because her father restrained her. In other words, the father has the right to invalidate the vows if on the day that he hears it, b'yom shamo, he says, I don't want the vows to stand. I nullify them. Then the vow is canceled, and God will forgive her for the non-fulfillment of the vow, because the father did not permit her to fulfill the vow. That's verse number 6. Let's go to the next verse. Keep going, scroll down. Now what about if she's married? If she becomes someone's wife, right? And she takes a vow. Keep scrolling down. The Shama Yisha b'yom Shamo. Again, if the husband hears and he's silent on the day that he hears, then the vows stand. That's verse number 8. But next verse. Scroll down, yeah. But if he again in b'yom Shmo Isha Yoniota, but if on the day he hears it, he restrains her. Then they fair in the draw, right? Same thing. Then they are invalidated. So this is called hafarat nedarim. That's what the Torah says. Sounds like the woman is either in the domain of her father or the domain of the husband vis-a-vis the vows. Now, he only has the right to annul them on the day he hears it. If he's silent, then they stand. If he restrains her, though, on that day, they are invalidated. She doesn't fulfill them. God will forgive her. It's not that God will forgive her for not fulfilling the vow because she can't fulfill it because the vow is then eliminated. Just read a couple more verses, then we'll get to the Mishnah. Keep going. Next, the Nedarim, but a divorced woman, a widow, whatever there is no husband, there is no father, then whatever vow she takes, Yakuma, the vow stands. Right? Now the next verse, take one or two more verses. Right. But while she's in the husband's house, she took the vow or the oath. Then one more verse. Keep going. Right? And the husband is silent, fine. Then if he's silent, then the vow stands, etc. This is the main point of the chapter over here, and this is called hafarat nedarim. Okay, this is the father of the husband. Now we'll get to some, with time allowed, we'll get to some of the details of this. But this chapter, that's chapter 10 and 11 of our Mishnah. But chapter 9 deals with something else. Not about a woman in the father's house or the husband's domain, but anybody, a woman who's not married and is no longer in the father's house, or any man. But these people can also annul their vows. How do they do that? They can annul the vows. This is the Mishnah in chapter 9, Rabbi Eliezer, chapter 9, Mishnah 1. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Potchim li'adam b'chavod avi v'imo, b'chachamim osrim. Okay, this is the Mishnah that assumes, something called hatarat nedarim. We're all familiar with hatarat nedarim. We know that before Rosh Hashanah, there's a custom for people to be matir their neder that they made in the previous year. You stand in front of 3 people, basically, social court of 3 people. You tell them you took vows in the previous year. You regret having taken them, and the 3 say it is forgiven. It mutalach, the vow is annulled. Mutalach, you are forgiven, etc., etc. That's the practice called hatarat nedarim. Kol nidre, that we discussed earlier in the year. The Kol Nidre ceremony, according to many, is exactly that. It's a kind of ceremonial hatarat nedarim. That's one view. The other view is that it's a annulment of vows you plan to take. It's saying preemptively those vows should not take effect. That's one view. But the other view, main view, is that it's actually kind of hatarat nedarim. The question is, how does one go about hatarat nedarim? As I mentioned earlier, the hatarat nedarim, as far as the Bible is concerned, doesn't exist. Quite the opposite. You take an oath in the Bible, you keep it no matter what. And there are multiple examples of that. But in any event, this is the rabbinic concept of hatarat nedarim. But how does this work? So let me just say briefly how it works. Okay? I took a vow. A vow is I'm not going to eat the asparagus for next year. Fine. And now, after a couple of months, I realized the couple of possibilities. I realized that when I said I'm not eating asparagus, I was in a terrible mood that day. I was just very angry at the world, and I lashed out at asparagus, no asparagus. And now I come in front of this court. The court is either 3 standard normal people or 1 expert. That's also in the Mishnah. But in any event, and I say, something, when I took the vow, or I took the oath, I was just in a terrible mood. I was not myself. I would never have done such a thing. I regret having done it. I can't, because my head was in a different place. And the court will say, oh, okay. In that case, then we annul the vow. That's one possibility. Then there's another possibility. My head was in a perfectly fine place. But when I took the vow, I intended to take the vow, but I didn't realize the consequences of the vow. I didn't realize that, I like to eat asparagus with many other foods, and Now, without the asparagus, I can't eat them. I didn't realize at the time the degree to which that would disturb me, my health or my eating habits or whatever it is. So I come up with something that my head was fine when I made the vow, right? But there were consequences, unforeseen consequences of the vow. And under those conditions, unforeseen consequences, the court has the right to say, okay, we render your vow invalid. Now, the question is, what kind of consequences? So that's what the debate, the first two mishnayot of chapter 9 are about. What consequences are good grounds for the annulment of a vow? So, for example, the first Mishnah of chapter 9, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Potchin li Adam b'chavod aviv u'b'chavod imo. Right. Someone comes into the court. I'll get to the language of it in a second. Someone comes to court and says, "Yeah, you took this vow. Did you realize at the time that you took the vow that it would impact negatively on your parents?" People that take a lot of vows very often seem to be people that are not careful how they speak, not careful in their commitments. And when your parents go to shul on Shabbos, the people are muttering, "Look at that couple. You know their kid is? The kid takes vows all the time." And it's very embarrassing to your parents. Did you realize that? So if the fellow who comes to court says, "No, I didn't realize that would impact on my parents," then the court can say, according to Rabbi Eliezer, okay, then obviously that vow is invalid because there were unforeseen consequences. And these kind of unforeseen consequences, had you known it, you would never have taken it. And therefore, we say this is a mistaken vow. That's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. The Chacham disagree. The Chacham say this kind of a rationale is insufficient to invalidate the vow. Amar Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok said, "Asher potchin lo b'chavod aviv ve'imo, yiftachu lo b'kavod hamakom." Imkain, a Nedarim. I can't read the blot out of it. Imkain, what's the next word there? Imkain, Imkain. Missing the next word. Yes. Imkain, ein Nedarim. In other words, Rabbi Tzadok says, given that rationale, they could say a different thing. Did you realize that in general, God is against taking Nedarim? That's one of the themes we encountered from the beginning of the Masechta. Kinidre Rishayim. I take a neder. I want to take a vow as wicked people do is a neder. Comments the Gemara, because good people, generally speaking, don't take vows. There's a very strong position in this tractate, and certainly in the Talmud, that taking vows is problematic. So someone comes to court, they say, "Do you realize that God doesn't like Nedarim?" Or they didn't realize that. So Rabbi Tzadok says, given that rationale, you never have a neder. Because every single neder, you could come to court and say, but God didn't want it. So that's not sufficient reason to invalidate the neder. And same thing is true of the parents. Those kinds of that kind of a consequence is not a valid consequence which allows the court to annul the vow. So there's a dispute in the Mishnah about how far we go with what kinds of consequences are valid or invalid. That's number one. But let me make a different point about Hatarat Nedarim. How would that be sort of the mechanics of Hatarat Nedarim? What Hatarat Nedarim accomplishes, essentially, is it renders the neder a neder b'tal'ut, a mistaken statement, a mistaken vow. We have a concept in the Talmud in general, and it's found in the Mishnah and many Gemaras about this, called the mekach ta'ut. You make a deal with somebody. I'm going to purchase X. And when you get home, you realize what you have is not the thing you bargained for. You intended to buy a certain kind of object, and the object that was given to you does not qualify legally as the object that you wanted to buy. You wanted to buy a chavit, a big barrel, and the guy gives you a small barrel or a mug, and you say, "Listen, I asked for a barrel. This is not a barrel." So the question is the question of language. What is a barrel in this community? What do they call a barrel? What do they call a cup? What do they call a mug? But if it's clear that it's a different object, then the sale was, you may have paid for it. You gave money, but you didn't get what you bargained for. That is
that like
called
false
mekach ta'ut.
false misrepresentation?
Yeah, I mean, and it actually invalidates. The point is, the sale never happened. In other words, my point over here, and this is a very important point for the Nedarim, a hatarat Nedarim means you never took the neder. It's not that I took a neder 3 months ago, for the next year no asparagus, and when I come in to the court, I say, and realize, they say, okay, the neder is invalid. It doesn't mean that from now on it's invalid. It means that it was never valid and you never took the vow in the first place, and that can have all kinds of consequences. Because whether the vow existed, one simple consequence is, suppose I already ate asparagus before. Have I violated the neder? If it's retroactively invalidated, I didn't violate the neder because there was no neder. It is true that when I ate the asparagus, I had no idea that maybe later I would go to the chacham or go to the court and invalidate it. But de facto, I did invalidate it, and it's invalidated from the time I took it. It's as if I never took a vow. I emphasize this is a very important point because we're going to get to hafarat nedarim in a couple of minutes, and that's different. Hafarat nedarim is completely different. Okay, so that's point number one. Hatarat nedarim comes under the general category of mistake, misrepresentation, mistake. I didn't get what I bargained for, so it never happened. That's hatarat nedarim. Now, there's something else in this Mishnah, which is the first words of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, potchin li'adam b'kavod avi ve'imo. What does the word potchim mean in the Mishnah? So here there's a dispute, the Rambam and others, as to what the word potchim means. Potchim can mean simply, in other words, the way one invalidates the vow is by having a petach, an opening or a door. In other words, the point is, you took a vow. But now you come and you say, I didn't realize X, Y, and Z. So that opens the door, as it were. That opens the possibility of invalidating the vow. Potchim, it's a petach. It's the way to open the door towards the invalidation of the vow. That's a simple reading of. But potchim can mean something else. Potchim, right, in Hebrew, in Talmudic Hebrew, in modern Hebrew as well, let's say you have a kind of colloquium, and someone is poteach. The first speaker is the inaugurating the event. When you have, right, you have a peticha to a book as an introduction. So potchim li'adam b'kavod avi ve'imo could mean something different. Somebody comes to court. I took a vow. You know, this asparagus thing, it really, you know, like, I wish I hadn't taken this thing, but I come to court and say, why are you here? I'm here about the vow that I took. And potchim means then the court says, let's see how we can help you. In other words, the point is, who takes the initiative in hatarat nedarim? So one way to read the Mishnah, which is, I think, the way the Rambam understands potchim, is that the court takes the initiative, generally speaking. Now, the Rambam could have cases where you can invalidate the vow, but the court might not take the initiative. There are certain vows, the Rambam says, where you can invalidate it. We're not going to take the initiative for this vow. And there are other situations where the court actually takes the initiative. Part of the question over here, and is a general question that comes up in Neder and certainly in Shua, and that is, to what degree? We have something called hatarat nedarim. It seems to be, the Mishnah itself says, it's a legal fiction that seems to have no basis in the Bible. But be that as it may, de facto, at the end of the day, we have this thing called hatarat nedarim. Question: to what extent do we encourage the use of hatarat nedarim, and to what extent do we say it's there for situations, but fundamentally, we don't want to employ it? And remember, if you took a shvuah, which is in God's name, which is one of the reasons that some of the later authorities don't like hatarat nedarim for shvuah, to employ it, in effect, turns out you took God's name in vain because it's never happening, because it never takes effect retroactively. So the question is, larger question would be, to what extent do we want the neder to encourage hatarat nedarim? That fundamentally is the Rambam's position, I believe. That fundamentally, we want people not to take nedarim and certainly not to take shua, for sure. So we like hatarat nedarim to get out of this thing because you should never have done it in the first place. Well, what do we say? No. You could argue the other side of the coin and say, look, whatever you think of neder, the guy took a neder. So once you take a neder, as the Torah says, keep your word. Is there a way out of it? Maybe. Can you employ it? Yes. But we're not going to actively encourage it. That's why I mentioned over here, the language of the Mishnah, potchim li adam. What does potchim mean? It means we find the petach, we find a way out. Or potchim means we take the initiative. The court takes the initiative. Okay, that's the first Mishnah of chapter 9. And this is what's called hatarat nedarim. Very important idea. And I have mentioned in the past that Kol Nidre ceremony that we Jews have, and probably is the most attended ceremony that Jews have, period, in terms of a public ceremony, in terms of the synagogue. More Jews go to Kol Nidre than anything else, which is very strange because Kol Nidre basically is a formulaic, let's say, annulment of vows. But it has enormous amount of impact. The idea that you can actually annul a vow. When the Torah says you can't, I mean, the plain reading of the Torah is, we somehow have the ability, we humans, to overturn the word of God, as it were, is something that is very powerful for us, because what Yom Kippur is about is sort of overturning God's negative decision about us. We make this audacious claim that we, the people, have the right, if we act appropriately, repent, we have the power to overturn God's decree. That's how we introduce Yom Kippur. So Hatarat Nedarim, actually, in terms of our practice, plays a pretty important role. It's a very important halacha, and we, again, one that seems to have no basis in the Torah. What has a basis in the Torah is what you have in chapter 10 and chapter 11. Now, let me just start with chapter 10, just because chapter 10 comes before chapter 11, even though chapter 11 is the right place to start. But I'll start with chapter 10. And this is a typical question about the Mishnah in general, the order of the Mishnah, which is very strange. But here we have the following Mishnah. Chapter 10, Mishnah 1, fascinating Mishnah. Nara ha'ma'orasa avia ubala mifirin nedareha. Hefera av v'lo hefera bal, hefera bal v'lo hefera av, eino mufar. Yein tzarich lomer shekiem echad mehen. A very interesting Mishnah. So let me take a couple of minutes to explain this Mishnah. It's like this. We saw the psukim in the Torah. The Torah says, if a woman took a vow, bin ureha, when she is a na'ara, then the father, on the day the father hears the vow, he can annul the vow. If he keeps his mouth shut, if he says nothing on the day that he hears it, let's say that day, he hears it on a Tuesday morning, he has till Tuesday night to say, I don't want the vow. If he says nothing, if he is silent, then the vow stands. Now, the first question is, what does it mean, bin ureha, when she's a na'ara? Na'ara hamorasad. The case of the Mishnah is a na'ara who's already engaged, is mekudeshet to her husband, but they're not living together yet. They had kedushin, but they didn't have nisuin. That's the Mishnah chapter 10. The Mishnah starts with an odd case, as the Mishnah often does. It doesn't start with a normal case, which is just under what conditions the father or the husband can be mayfair. The Mishnah gives us a strange case. She's a married woman, but not living with the husband, and she's a nara. And here's the point. How old is the in terms of the Gemara, it turns out that there are limits placed upon the ability to be mayfair the neder. For the father is only allowed to be mayfair the neder up to the time that his daughter is a na'ara. In other words, when she's still a na'ara. There are 3 stages in the Mishnah, and the Talmud picks this up. Saying for the girl, she can be a katana. She's a minor. and the girl reaches her majority at age 12. Up to 12 years old, she is a katana. Fine. From 12, for the next 6 months, according to the Gemara, she has the status of a nara, just for 6 months. And after 6 months, she's what the Gemara calls a bogeret. She's a bogeret. She's bagrut. She's an adult. Now, question is, let's say she's not married. Under what conditions can the father be made for the neder? So the Mishnah has the father being made for the neder only up to 12 years and 6 months. She's still a nara. Beyond 12 years and 6 months, she's not a nara, and she leaves the father's domain for the purpose of neder. He can't be made for the neder. On the other hand, how old is she when she takes the neder? So a katana can't take a neder. So when she's a katana, she can't take a neder. Now, there's another rule you should be familiar with. It's a good thing to know. It's called the mufla samuch la'ish. It's not in this Mishnah. But a mufla samuch la'ish is a special law about a neder that for a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, they can take vows 1 year before they reach the majority. That is, a boy who's 12 and a girl who was 11, they have a special category called the mufla samuch la'ish, and they can take a neder. Whether that is a Torah rule or a rabbinic rule is a question, but that is the rule. So it's possible that this girl could take vows from the time she's 11 until she's 12 and a half. And in that period of time, the father, on the day that he hears it, has the right to annul the vow. If the father does not annul the vow, that is to say, he cannot annul the vow in 2 different ways. One is he can keep his mouth shut. He says nothing. He heard it, but that day he said nothing. Then the vow stands. Now there's another possibility which the Mishnah mentions. Or it can be mekayem the neder. Being mekayem the neder is different than being silent. Someone says, Yanko, your daughter took a vow not to eat watermelon. And he says, that's a great thing. What a wonderful idea. I'm totally support it. That's called kiyum. Once he says that, the vow stands, he can't annul it. That's called kiyum. I'm not getting into some of the other details that the Gemara deals with, but so there's 3 things. There's hafara, where he says no. There's the silence on the day he hears it, which in fact he can't be made for. Or he can say great. That's called kiyum. Fine. That's as far as the father is concerned. Now, what about as far as the husband is concerned? So the husband can be made for his wife's Nedarim once they're actually living together. But if she's mekudeshet, but she's mureset. Mureset means mekudeshet. They had kedushin, but they're not living together yet. Then she is called a nara ha'ma'or rasa. And in that situation, says the Mishnah in chapter 10, she's in the domain of a husband and the father. She hasn't left the father's domain because she's not living with this guy yet. On the other hand, she is married to the guy, so he has some rights. So according to the Mishnah of chapter 10, this is typical of the Mishnah, to start with this odd case. Nara hamurasa. If the woman was engaged, we call it engaged. She's not exactly engaged. She's married, but not living together with the husband, then the only way to annul her vows is if the father and the husband both annul it. But if the father annuls it, but not the husband, heifer avo, heifer abao, or reverse, heifer abavo, heifer av, eino mufa. It's not annulled. And certainly, if one of them said it's good, that's called kiyum. He validates it. He says, great idea. Then that's it. And certainly, the other person has no right to be made for. So the Mishnah, as it typically does, starts with the odd case, the liminal case. The Talmud loves liminal cases. She's not fully married, and she hasn't fully left his domain. She's somewhat in his domain, and she's somewhat connected to the husband. Under those situations, she can, her vows stand unless both of them at the same time, on the same day, annul the vow. This is hafar. Okay. Now there's another question I want to deal with in the Mishnah. The Mishnah deals with it. But before we get to the other question, I want to make a different point about hafara as opposed to hatara. This is ever studied the tractate in Nedarim, this is a big thing. There's a difference between hafara and hatara, a major difference between the two of them. And that is that when it comes to hataras Nedarim, as I explained, fundamentally, it's the concept of a tolut. It's a mistake. So it never happened. When you go to the court and the court says, did you realize this? Did you realize that? I didn't realize it. Then the court says, okay, the vow was mutar lach, and that is, it's as if you never took a vow. It never happened. It's invalidated retroactively. That's not true of hafara. When the father or the husband invalidates on the day that he hears it, the Yom Shamo, in those circumstances, it's invalidated from here on in. But it's not invalidated from the beginning. It is a good vow. And therefore, let's say the woman took a vow and she ate asparagus after 2 months. Then the father hears about it 3 months later, and or the husband, and they say no go. She is still liable for violating the vow. Whereas if she went to the court and said, I felt bad about it, and the court said mutalach, then she's not guilty, because she didn't really, even though she had bad intentions. But from a pure standpoint, a legal standpoint, she has not violated the vow. There's a very important difference between hatara and hafara. The language of the Talmud, when it talks about hafara, is megaz gayes. It cuts it off. From this point on, it cuts it off, but it doesn't render it a mistake. Okay. Now,
excuse me, can I ask
yes,
you something?
of
Could
course.
another difference be that hatara is something that you bring up, that you instigate, while hafara is not something that you, the person who made the neder, instigate, but something
Yes,
that
sure.
is put on you?
For sure. Look, the din of, I'm not. I never get into these things, not in this context. The fact of the matter is, I would say from my perspective, people say, "Are you a feminist?" I say, I am, but I'm basically a humanist, I would say. I mean, this doesn't speak to the way I live, that the woman is in the domain of her husband. I mean, the idea that the husband can just, without explanation, by the way, doesn't have to give a reason. That's another difference. When you go to the court, this is a very important point. I should have mentioned this. When you go to the court, you went to the court and you say, I took this vow and I didn't realize the consequences, or I was in a bad mood when I took it, or whatever. If you say, I didn't realize, the court will say, postscript, did you realize this? Did you realize that? They ask a lot of questions. You need grounds. You can't just come to court and say, I don't want the vow. You need appropriate grounds. That's not true of hafara. When it comes to hafara, the husband doesn't have to say why. Why did you invalidate the vow? That's not my thing. Because I'm having a bad day, because my team lost today, or whatever. Who knows? Fact is, no need to explain. So to that degree, the woman is, as far as the neder, is in the domain of the husband or the father. And I think for the way most of us are probably living, I think that's something which we see is quite foreign to the way we think. But that is in terms of now. I will say one thing about the Chumash, actually, and that is that the truth is that when you read the Chumash, I would say that the Chumash, yes, the husband or the father has the right to simply say, no way, without giving explanations. But I would say two things about it. First of all, it's hard to know what the assumptions were 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But one could make the claim, I think, that the fact that the Chumash limits it to the day that he hears it, and unless he actively invalidates it, it's valid, that already says something. That's point number one. But point number two, then if you remember the psukim that we just read, if the husband or the father invalidates it, Heini aviyota b'yom shamo, then all the vows are invalid. Then the Torah adds, Vashem yislach la, God will forgive her because the husband has invalidated it. Now, what's interesting is that the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva, understood it the following way. What do you mean God will forgive her? So Rabbi Akiva says, why does she need forgiveness? The vow is not valid anymore. So it's an invalid vow. So right? So what do you mean God will forgive her? She didn't do anything wrong. Says Rabbi Akiva, is talking about the following case, that the husband invalidated it, but she didn't know that. She assumes the vow is still valid, and then a week later she eats her asparagus. As far as she's concerned, she did an avera. So the Torah says, yes, but since technically speaking it's not valid, God will forgive her, from which Rabbi Akiva says, and you see something that if the Torah said, when somebody objectively did nothing wrong, but had bad intention, she needs forgiveness, how much more so when someone actually does something wrong. That's Rabbi Akiva's drush. But that's not the pshat of the psukim. That so it can't be the pshat of the psukim, that God will forgive her. I don't think so. I think the better pshat is something else. God will forgive her for not fulfilling the vow. You take a vow, you're supposed to keep your word. But this woman can't keep her word because the father or the husband has intervened and said there is no vow. So therefore, she's not keeping it. The vow doesn't exist. What happened to the vow? It's invalid. She can do whatever she wants now. You have no more vow. Says the Chumash, yes. She'll be forgiven for not keeping the vow because the husband prevented it from happening. And that's an interesting idea. In other words, fundamentally, then the Chumash is saying she should keep the vow. Okay, the husband has the right, or the father, to abrogate the vow only on the day he hears it, and he has to say it. If he either says it's good, or even if he's silent, the vow stands. So one could read it into the Chumash. I'm just saying, I'm not engaging in apologetics. I think it's the pshat. But the fact of the matter is, just to be very straightforward about it, I'll speak for myself. This doesn't reflect the way I think I see marriage relationships or women in the homes of their parents. Even though when you think about it, it's quite limited in time because it's for the father, it's only till she's 12 and a half, and she can't take vows minimally till 11. And according to one view, b'doraita, not till she's 12. So it's a limited. The husband is more wide ranging because he can always invalidate. Now, if she's not married and she's more than 12 and a half, then all the vows stand, says the Chumash. So this is the rule of Hafarat Nedarim. The question is, why would the Torah give such a narrow window? I think what I'm suggesting is the Torah might give a narrow window to do this because fundamentally the Torah is moving away from the idea that the woman is fully in the husband's domain. It's the question is how you read the Chumash. Why does the Torah say, let's take something like slavery. The Torah knows of slavery. The Torah did not eliminate slavery, actually, and not in Parashat Mishpatim. When you get to Sefer Vayikra, it's not clear. But it's one thing is clear in the Chumash. The Chumash is not in favor of slavery. Slavery means you're a slave for forever, basically. And in the Chumash, at least a Jewish slave goes free after 6 years and may go free in other ways as well. Plus, somebody else can redeem the slave, etc. So the Chumash is moving us in a certain direction. The Gemara goes further with it. When it comes to the Hebrew slave basically isn't a slave. For the most part, the Hebrew slave is largely an employee with all kinds of rights. So I say it would depend upon one's general view about how we see the Chumash working in general. And I do subscribe to the view that the Chumash points us in certain directions, and it's up to the interpreters of the Torah to interpret it in the spirit and to move forward, which I think is what largely what the Torah Sheba'al Peh is about. That's a much broader question about Torah Sheba'al Peh. So I'd simply point out that over here, again, I don't know what the givens were, but if the givens were that the father or the husband can always invalidate all vows whenever, then the Chumash is placing a lot of limitation on what the husband can do. That's possible. I mean, it's one possibility. In any event, but the first thing in learning is to see what it actually says. Then we'll how we respond to it that's already secondary, but not secondary in importance. but secondary in the way one learns. First, let's see what it says. It raises a million questions. And then the question is how has our tradition dealt with it? How do we respond to it? These are all important questions. This is chapter 10. So we did chapter 9, Mishnah 1, chapter 10, Mishnah 1. I did want to make one other point about chapter 9, which is the following. I alluded to it, but we didn't look at it in the Mishnah. And as in just for a moment, in chapter 9, Mishnah number 2, just the beginning of chapter 9, Mishnah 2, Rabbi Eliezer was found in Mishnah number 1. Od Omar Rabbi Eliezer, Potchin Benolad, V'chachamim Osrim. So this is in terms of Hatorat Nedarim. Back to Hatorat Nedarim again. I wanted just to mention that the Mishnah number 2 of chapter 9 has the following disagreement of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Whether Potchim Benolad. Potchim Benolad is a very interesting question. Someone comes to court and says, I took this vow, but I didn't realize the consequences of my vow. Okay? Now, under those conditions, if the court accepts the thinking, the court renders the vow a mistaken vow. Never happens. But the question is, what kind of conditions are we talking about? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, there was a much broader view of Hatarat Nedarim. Potrim Benolad means, I said, I'm not going to, that guy was my next door neighbor who I dislike. I'm not getting any benefit from him. Fine. But then it turns out that this next door neighbor of mine, I thought was some schlepper or whatever, turns out he becomes a scribe. Or something else happens to this fellow. And at the time I took the neder, I had no idea what's going to be with him. And it turns out I needed his services. Or we have other kinds of social connections. But at the time I made the neder, they didn't exist. So that's not something that existed at the time. I was unaware of it. Something didn't exist yet. He turns out to be, if it comes up this famous personality, he changes, whatever. So Rabbi Eliezer says to make all of these things, says Rabbi Eliezer, since we're in a new circumstance, we can then, the court has the right to annul the vow. The court could even, according to the Rama initiate, say, we can, but according to the Chachamim, and then there's two possibilities in the Mishnah. One is that doesn't work at all. You can't annul the vow based on new information. You can only annul the vow on information that existed at the time, but you were unaware of it. Now the question, of course, and the Talmud discusses this, what does it mean, information that existed at the time? What does existed mean? Because, of course, something might not exist at the time, in fact, but it's something that is likely to exist in the future. So that's really where the issue comes up in the Mishnah. In other words, so-and-so is in a certain path, and then the person ends up on wherever the person ended up, but at the time you could even see the person getting there. That's one possibility. And maybe that does work. That's not a no-lie. As opposed to something which is just out of the blue. Something happened, you could never, an unanticipated thing. That's what the Talmud discusses. What is anticipated and unanticipated? What is new? What exists at a time? It doesn't exist yet, but you could realize it. But it's the probability is it will exist. So this is what the Talmud discusses. The Mishnah, as I said many times, is the gateway. But the Mishnah puts out this question of no lie. I just wanted to make that point. The question again, the larger question is to what degree the court has latitude to annul vows, to annul oaths. And part of the issue is to what degree does that tradition want them to annul vows and to annul the oaths? It's only a related question. Let me get to, since time is fleeting here, I wanted to mention one other Mishnah, which is the last chapter, chapter 11, which deals with Hafarat Nedarim. Chapter 10 deals with the odd case of Hafarat Nedarim, the woman who is betrothed, the Nara Hamurasa, who ends up to be in the domain of two different, both the husband and the father. The Mishnah and the Gemara love those kind of cases, or these cases on the liminal cases, the cases on the border, because that's what you can often test the law by looking at the cases on the border. So the Mishnah likes that. Let's take a look now in the little time that we have left, unfortunately, as to the question which we would have put first: what vows can the father or husband annul? Can they annul any vow, or is it limited? So now the Mishnah limits severely the vows that the husband can annul. He can't annul most vows. He can only annul certain vows. And these are the vows that the husband can annul. V'elu Nedarim, chapter 11, Mishnah 1. V'elu Nedarim shu mefer. Devarim sheyesh b'hem inui nefesh. Im erchatz v'im lo erchatz. Im et kashet v'im lo et kashet. Rabbi Yossi, ein elu nidre inui nefesh. Again, this is Mishnah number 1. Then the Mishnah goes on to more discussion about this concept called inui nefesh. And then, one second. Okay, let me stick to this Mishnah. Okay, the Torah says kol neder v'chol yisrael la'anot nefesh, but actually the pasuk mentions inui nefesh. The Mishnah and the Gemara have two kinds of vows that a husband can annul. Two kinds of vows. The Torah only mentioned one of them. The Torah mentioned inui nefesh, when someone afflicts one's soul. So the question is, what does it mean? If the woman takes a neder that afflicts her soul, that it limits her in some way, he has the right to annul the vow. Now the question the Mishnah deals with is, what does it mean, inui nefesh? So the Mishnah in the first gives two examples of it. One example is the woman. The woman took a vow that she's not going to she's not going to wash, she's not going to take a bath, not going to wash, or she's not going to put on jewelry or dress up, that kind of thing. Whoever took the vow, she's not going to dress nicely, and she's not going to wash. So there's a disagreement in the Mishnah. Does this qualify as inui nefesh? You're not going to wash. What does it mean not going to wash? You're never going to wash your face, not going to take a shower. What does that mean? Rabbi Yossi says that's not inui. It's unpleasant, perhaps, but it's not inui. Now, the Gemara, though, raises a different question, which is, the Gemara has two categories with a husband, and only two, where the husband has the right to annul the vow of his wife. One is when the woman, and this is in the Chumash, vows that the woman takes to afflict herself. That's called inui nefesh. That's the pasuk in the Torah. Kol neder v'chol yisrael la'anot nefesh. Isha yikimenu v'isha yiferenu. But then the Gemara has another category, which is not in the Torah, what the Gemara calls dvarim shebeino lebeina, things that impact on the husband, on married life, any range of things that impact on the husband. So these are the two categories of things that the husband has the right to be mefer. Rabbi Yossi says these are not inui nefesh, but he might agree that these are beino lebeina. Now, what is the difference between inui nefesh and beino lebeina? So there's a fundamental difference between the two of them. I want to mention that. Inui nefesh, if the woman takes a vow to afflict herself, and the Torah says the husband has the right to annul that vow, then if he annuls the vow is annulled, period. And there's no vow. But there's another category where the husband can annul a vow if the vow impacts on him as the husband. Maybe never to dress up at all could qualify as beino lebeina. Okay? She takes a vow never to sleep with anybody, no man in her life. That affects the husband. He can annul that vow. That's beino lebeina. But in beino lebeina, and here's the interesting point, when he annuls that vow, he only annuls the vow vis-a-vis himself. If he took a vow, a general vow, that affects everybody, including the husband, okay? If it's beino lebeina, and he annuls it, he only can annul it vis-a-vis himself. he can't annul it via anybody else. Now, the woman says, I'm not sleeping with any man anymore. Fine. And he knows the vow. And then he divorces her, and then she remarries. That vow stands. The new husband would have to, which you actually can't annul it either in that case, she'd have to go to a beit din to annul the vow, to get hatarat nedarim. Whereas inui nefesh, he has the right his right to annul the vow. He annuls the vow, and the vow doesn't exist. From here on in, of course, the vow doesn't exist. This is the Mishnah. What the Mishnah does not talk about, and here we have a big fight between the Rambam and everybody else about the following situation. The Mishnah in chapter 11 only talks about Nidre Inui Nefesh. It's talking about the husband. The question is, what about the father? This is that the Mishnah doesn't deal with this actually. When you say the father can annul vows, up until the time she's 12 and a half years old, which, as I pointed out, is a very limited amount of time, because when she's a minor, she can't take vows altogether. So it's maximally a year and a half, and it could even be that from the Torah, it's only half a year. Well, fine, but what vows can he annul? The Rambam thinks the father can annul any vow. She's simply in the father's domain. That's how the Rambam sees it. And the father can annul any and all vows. Whereas many of the other Rishonim say no, that's not true. Whatever rules apply to the husband apply to the father. Now it's different. In other words, what beino lebeino for the father and daughter are different than for the woman and her husband, obviously. But however we define things between them, things that relate to their relationship, that he can annul. He can also annul inu nefesh, but he can't annul anything else. If it's neither of those two, then she's independent. So that actually is interesting. If you adopt the general view, not the Rambam, then it turns out that it's quite a severe limitation on what the husband and the father can annul. Most vows, they can't annul at all. So once again, you see another, I would say, a limitation or an interpretation of the Torah to limit it. It could even be the pshat of the Chumash, actually. But once again, what the Mishnah is interesting. It's interesting for us that here you have this idea of again, the role of the woman, which is why this is in Seder Nashim. But you do see from the Mishnah, and so from the Chumash, I think, is to some extent the attempt to limit this rule that a woman is always either in the domain of the husband or the domain of the father. So again, to review what we have here today, and there's so much more here, but I did want to make sure we at least covered this before we complete our little study of the second. I try to touch on, in these few weeks that we have together, touch on the main point about a neder and about a shvur. There's so much more here. We can't leave them at the tractate without dealing with hatarat nedarim and hafarat nedarim. Hatarat nedarim, many of us are familiar with. Hafarat nedarim, I've never heard of anybody nowadays doing hafarat nedarim. But in any event, there is this interesting principle, interesting distinction between them. Hatarat nedarim is I would say one, if not the most classical rabbinic teaching that we have, because it really is, it flies in the face of what the Bible seems to say, and the Mishnah itself says it, not in Tractate Nedarim, but in Tractate Chagiga, as I mentioned, Hetz Nedarim Parchin Ba'avir. They float in the air, and they have no basis. That's called Hatarat Nedarim. Okay, I encourage everybody to continue with the Mishnah, and as I said, it's really a gateway to the whole rabbinic tradition. Nedarim is particularly interesting. I should say one thing at the end for two reasons. First of all, the very idea that the human being can create restrictions is something which, on the face of it, is a fascinating idea. I mean, because you could easily say we have 613 commandments. Okay, when God commands, we obey. But what do you mean? We're gonna create a new prohibition? I can't drink apple juice. Or what is that? But you see that especially when it comes not even to the neder as much as from the shvua. I took a shvua not to do X. And the Torah says you have to do it. How can you do that? You're mushba me Har Sinai. You already took an oath from Har Sinai to keep God's commandments. That very expression of Mushba Mihar Sinai is very striking. It talks about the commandments in the same way we talk about someone taking a personal oath. So the idea that you can actually take a neder, take a shvua, that actually takes effect is fascinating on one hand. And on the other hand, this idea that you can actually undo it, which flies in the face of what it says in the Torah and it says in the Tanakh, is also a fascinating principle of Hatarat Nedarim. Okay, we'll have to stop at this point. Next week, Rabbi Avi Wolfish will he's a great expert in Mishnah, actually. And it's be very interesting to study with him because it's very deep insights when it comes to the Mishnah. Thank you all for participating. Look forward to learning with you in the future.
And with that,
Thank
I
you
want
so
to
much.
highlight one more class. While next week we will be continuing Mishnah in Depth with Rabbi Avi Wolfish at 1:30 on April 7th and at 1 p.m. for the rest of the series. Next Sunday, April 7th at 12 p.m. is Grisha's 25th annual Rappaport lecture. We would love to see you there. I am posting the link to sign up in chat. And if you are able to join us on Zoom or on Facebook Live, I really hope you do.
Yeah, I hope so too. I'm actually giving that 25th lecture, and it's going to be about the Seder. So if you, I think it should be interesting, and if, people might be interested, please tell them to join us next Sunday at 12. Thank you very much. Have a good week.
All right.
Thank you so much.
And if you have any
Can
questions,
I ask you a question, David?
Yes.
Why would somebody make a neder not to wash?
That is a very
Why
good
would
question.
they give it? Why would they give that as an example?
Well, the Mishnah gives all kinds of crazy examples. So that's not,
Right.
I mean, it could be that she's angry at her husband. That's certainly possible, Same way, I'm not gonna dress up, I'm not gonna wash, you know what I mean? And
But she knows he's going to be Mayfair as soon as he hears about it.
oh, he may not hear about it. Who knows? Maybe. It's hard to know, really. The Mishnah picks all kinds of crazy cases, the Gemara even more so. It's sort of testing the limits is what they do. Of every legal system, they test the limits. And I'm not even sure why someone would do such a thing. I can't answer that. There are a lot of crazy cases, but it's a good question. But I would say in terms of the legal system, I think they test the limits very, very often, even when the cases seem extremely improbable.
And since you mentioned it, are there any cases of Hafvarat Nedarim today?
I've never
Debbie,
heard
I'm afraid this is going to have to be the last question.
I've never heard it.
Okay,
All right,
thank you.
then. Very good. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye.